In the harsh Texas frontier, where survival depends on grit and determination, Sarah McKinnon has carved out a life alone on her isolated ranch after her husband's mysterious death. But when a devastating storm strikes and her hand-built barn begins collapsing around her, she faces her greatest challenge, yet going into labor with no one to help. Just when all hope seems lost, the sound of horse hooves stops at her gate. Sheriff James Crawford, haunted by his own dark past, has been tracking dangerous outlaws when destiny brings him to Sarah's doorstep. Between life and death, birth and destruction, two wounded souls will find each other on a night that changes everything. But when the truth about her husband's death emerges, Crawford must choose between the law he swore to uphold and the woman who awakens feelings he thought were buried forever. This is a story of survival, redemption, and unexpected love in the untamed territories of the American West. The first crack of thunder rolled across the Texas plains like cannon fire, and Sarah McKinnon knew this storm would be different from the others. She pressed her hand against her swollen belly, feeling the baby kick restlessly, as if sensing the approaching danger. 8 months pregnant and alone on her isolated ranch, she watched the wall of black clouds racing toward her homestead with the fury of an unleashed demon. Lightning split the darkening sky, illuminating the weathered barn that stood 50 yards from her small wooden house. Sarah had built that structure with her own hands after Thomas died. Every nail driven with the stubborn determination that had kept her alive these past 2 years. Now, as the wind began to howl across the open range, she could see the barn's roof boards lifting and straining against their rings, like a caged animal fighting to break free. The first raindrop hit her window with the sound of a bullet, followed by another, then a deluge that turned the world outside into a gray sheet of water. Sarah moved away from the window, one hand supporting her back as a dull ache spread through her lower spine. She'd been feeling strange all day, a restless energy that made her pace the confines of her small home like a trapped wildcat. Another flash of lightning revealed her barn door hanging open, banging violently in the wind. Her heart sank as she realized she'd forgotten to secure it after feeding the horses that morning. Those animals represented her entire livelihood, the only thing standing between her and destitution in this unforgiving land. Sarah grabbed her heavy coat and stepped onto the covered porch, immediately feeling the storm's raw power as rain stung her face. The distance to the barn seemed to stretch endlessly before her, but she had no choice. Without those horses, she and her unborn child would never survive the coming winter. She ran as best she could, her heavy belly making each step awkward and uncertain. The muddy ground sucked at her boots, and twice she nearly fell as lightning turned the world white around her. By the time she reached the barn, she was soaked through and breathing hard, her heart hammering against her ribs. Inside the barn, her 2 horses whinnied nervously in their stalls, their eyes rolling white with fear. Sarah moved quickly to calm them, speaking in the gentle tone that Thomas had taught her years ago. As she worked to secure their leads, a sharp pain shot through her abdomen, doubling her over and stealing her breath. "Not now," she whispered, through gritted teeth, recognizing the unmistakable sensation. "Please, not now." But her body had its own timeline, and as another contraction gripped her, stronger than the first, Sarah realized that her baby had chosen this moment to enter the world. She looked around the barn desperately, as if somehow help might materialize from the shadows. But she was alone, as she'd been for the past 2 years. A tremendous crash of thunder shook the entire structure, and Sarah looked up to see one of the main support beams beginning to sag under the strain of the storm. Chunks of wood and debris rained down around her as the roof started to buckle. Her horses reared in terror, their hooves striking the stall doors as they fought to escape. Sarah tried to move toward the barn door, but another contraction hit her like a physical blow, dropping her to her knees in the straw. Through the pain, she could hear the ominous groaning of stressed timber above her head. The barn she'd built with such pride and determination was coming apart, and she was trapped inside with nowhere to run. As the walls began to lean inward and more debris crashed down around her, Sarah closed her eyes and prepared for the end. This was how it would finish alone in the storm. Just like Thomas had died alone somewhere out on the range. Then, through the howling wind and crashing thunder, she heard something that made her heart leap with desperate hope. Horse hooves, moving fast and purposeful through the storm, coming to a stop just outside her gate. Sheriff James Crawford had been tracking the Dawson gang for 3 days across the unforgiving Texas plains when the storm caught him. The outlaws had robbed a bank in Amarillo and killed 2 innocent bystanders in their escape, leaving a trail of blood and broken lives that Crawford felt duty-bound to follow. No matter where it led, the rain hit like bullets from heaven, and Crawford pulled his hat low as his black stallion fought against the driving wind. Lightning illuminated the landscape in brief, stark moments, revealing a world transformed into something wild and dangerous. He'd lost the gang's trail hours ago when the rain washed away their tracks. But something deeper than duty kept him riding through the storm. At 34, Crawford carried scars, both visible and hidden. A jagged line ran from his left temple to his jaw, a souvenir from a knife fight with a cattle rustler 2 years back. But the wounds that cut deepest were the ones no one could see. The memories of choices that haunted his dreams and followed him like shadows across the frontier. Through the storm's fury, he spotted a faint light flickering in the distance. As he rode closer, Crawford could make out a small homestead nestled against a rocky outcrop, smoke rising from its chimney despite the driving rain. He was about to ride past when a sound that chilled his blood cut through the storm's roar. Woman's scream. Crawford spurred his horse toward the homestead, his hand instinctively moving to the colt at his hip. As he approached the gate, he could see that the barn was collapsing, its roof caving in with thunderous crashes that competed with the storm itself. Another scream came from inside the failing structure, filled with pain and desperation. Without hesitation, Crawford dismounted and ran toward the barn, ducking falling debris as he fought his way inside. In the chaos of collapsing timber and panicked horses, he saw her. A woman with dark hair plastered to her face by rain and sweat, down on her knees in the straw, her body convulsing with what he immediately recognized as labor pains. "Ma'am, we need to get you out of here," Crawford shouted over the noise of the storm and the groaning timbers above them. Sarah McKinnon looked up at the stranger with eyes wide with pain and fear. Through her agony, she saw a man with weathered features and kind eyes, wearing a sheriff's star that caught the lightning's glare. "The baby," she gasped between contractions. "It's coming now." Crawford looked up at the sagging roof beams and knew they had minutes, maybe less, before the entire structure came down. He'd seen enough births during his years as a lawman to know that moving her might be dangerous, but staying here meant certain death for both mother and child. "Can you stand?" he asked, moving to her side and placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Sarah tried to rise, but another contraction doubled her over, more intense than any before. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't move." Crawford made his decision. He swept Sarah up in his arms, just as a massive support beam crashed down where she'd been kneeling, crushing the spot with devastating force. Her horses reared and broke free from their stalls, galloping out into the storm as Crawford carried Sarah toward safety. The sheriff's muscles strained under her weight as he navigated the collapsing barn, dodging falling planks and twisted metal. Rain lashed them as they emerged into the open, and Crawford could feel Sarah's body trembling in his arms. Whether from cold, pain, or both, he carried her to the small house and kicked open the door, grateful to find it unlocked. Inside, a fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Crawford laid Sarah gently on the rough-hewn table near the fireplace, his mind racing as he tried to remember everything he'd learned about childbirth during his years on the frontier. "What's your name?" he asked, pulling off his soaked coat and rolling up his sleeves. "Sarah," she managed between rapid breaths. Sarah McKinnon. The name hit Crawford like a physical blow. McKinnon. He'd heard that name before, connected to something dark and unfinished from his past, but before he could process the implications, Sarah's scream filled the small cabin as another powerful contraction gripped her. "The baby's coming," Sarah gasped, her fingers digging into the wooden table. "I can feel it." Crawford pushed his troubling thoughts aside and focused on the immediate crisis. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the Texas plains, but inside the small cabin, a new life was fighting to enter the world. As he prepared to help deliver Sarah's child, Crawford couldn't shake the feeling that this night would change everything he thought he knew about justice, duty, and the ghosts that haunted his past. The storm raged outside, while inside the small cabin, life and death hung in delicate balance. Crawford had assisted in enough frontier births to know the basics, but his hands trembled as he prepared to help Sarah bring her child into the world. The flickering firelight cast dancing shadows across her pain-contorted face as another powerful contraction seized her body. "Breathe," Crawford said gently, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Just breathe through it." Sarah's fingers clutched the edges of the wooden table until her knuckles turned white. "Something's wrong," she gasped between ragged breaths. "It shouldn't hurt this much." Crawford tried to project calm confidence, but privately he shared her concern. He'd seen enough difficult births to recognize the signs of complications. "Tell me about your husband," he said, hoping to distract her from the pain. "Thomas McKinnon." Sarah's eyes flew open, meeting his gaze with sudden intensity. "How do you know Thomas?" The question hung in the air like gunsmoke. Crawford felt the weight of old guilt pressing down on his chest, as memories he'd tried to bury clawed their way to the surface. "I was there," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the storm. "The night he died." Another contraction hit Sarah, but this time she fought through the pain to stare at Crawford with growing understanding. "You're the sheriff who found him?" Crawford nodded, unable to meet her eyes. 3 months ago, I got word that someone was rustling cattle from the ranches along the Rio Grande." Thomas fit the description of one of the suspects. "Thomas would never steal cattle," Sarah said fiercely, even as sweat beaded her forehead from the labor pains. "I know that now," Crawford replied, his voice heavy with regret. "But at the time, I had witnesses who swore they'd seen him with the stolen herd. I tracked him to Devil's Canyon that night, found him alone by a campfire." Sarah's breathing grew more labored as the contractions intensified, but her eyes never left Crawford's face. "What happened?" Crawford closed his eyes, remembering that terrible night with crystal clarity. "I called out for him to surrender, told him I had a warrant for his arrest. But Thomas panicked. Maybe he thought I was one of the real rustlers. Coming to silence him, he went for his gun, and you shot him." The words were spoken without accusation, just a statement of terrible fact. Crawford nodded, feeling the familiar burn of guilt in his chest. "I had no choice. It was him or me. But afterward, when I searched his belongings, I found letters. Letters from you, talking about the baby coming, about how much you loved him." Sarah screamed as another contraction overwhelmed her, and Crawford could see that the baby was finally coming. He positioned himself to help, his hands steady despite the emotional turmoil churning inside him. "Then I found his journal," Crawford continued as he worked. "Entries about suspicious activity around the ranch, about men he'd seen moving cattle at night. Thomas wasn't a rustler. He was investigating the thefts, trying to protect his neighbors." The truth hit Sarah like a physical blow, but before she could respond, the final contraction seized her. Crawford guided the baby's head as it emerged, then the shoulders, and finally the tiny body slipped into his waiting hands. The infant's cry filled the cabin, strong and clear above the storm's fury. "It's a boy," Crawford said, his voice thick with emotion as he wrapped the newborn in a clean cloth and placed him in Sarah's arms. Sarah gazed down at her son, tears streaming down her face. The baby had Thomas's dark hair and strong features, a living reminder of the man she'd lost. "He would have been so proud," she whispered. Crawford cleaned his hands in the basin by the fire, then returned to Sarah's side. "There's more you need to know," he said reluctantly. "After Thomas died, I kept investigating. I found the real rustlers a week later. The Hendricks brothers from over in Laredo. They'd been using your husband as a scapegoat, spreading lies about him to cover their own tracks." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "So Thomas died for nothing?" "No," Crawford said firmly. "He died protecting what he loved. You, this land, the life you'd built together." He paused, struggling with the words. "I'm the one who failed him. I should have investigated more carefully before acting." Outside, the storm was beginning to weaken, but inside the cabin, the real tempest was just beginning. Sarah held her newborn son close while studying the face of the man who had killed her husband, yet saved both their lives tonight. The dawn broke clear and bright across the Texas plains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that seemed impossible after the fury of the previous night. Sarah sat by the window, cradling her newborn son, while watching Crawford tend to the horses that had survived the storm. The collapsed barn lay in ruins, but somehow, it no longer seemed like the end of everything. Instead, it felt like the remnants of an old life making way for something new. Crawford had spent the night in the barn's remains, unable to bring himself to sleep under the same roof as the woman whose husband he'd killed. Sarah had watched him through the window, pacing among the debris like a man wrestling with demons only he could see. She understood that torment, had lived with her own version of it since Thomas died. When Crawford finally approached the house, his hat in his hands and exhaustion etched into every line of his face, Sarah made her decision. She opened the door before he could knock, her baby sleeping peacefully in her arms. "I've been thinking all night," she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions churning inside her. "About Thomas, about what you told me, about what happens now." Crawford's eyes were redrimmed with sleeplessness and guilt. "Mrs. McKinnon, I know there's nothing I can say that will bring your husband back or ease your pain. I'll be turning in my badge when I get back to town. A man who makes the kind of mistake I made has no business wearing a star." Sarah studied his face, seeing the genuine anguish there. "Thomas kept a journal, like you said. I read it after he died, but I didn't understand it then. He wrote about men he'd seen moving cattle at night, about feeling like he was being watched. He was scared, but he was also determined to protect our neighbors. He was a good man," Crawford said quietly. "Better than I gave him credit for. Yes, he was." Sarah shifted the baby to her other arm, marveling at how such a small life could already feel so important. "But Thomas is gone, and I have a son to raise now, this ranch to run. I can't spend the rest of my life hating you for a mistake made in a moment of confusion." Crawford looked up sharply, hope flickering in his eyes like a candle flame in the wind. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that my son is going to grow up in a world where good men sometimes make terrible choices, and terrible men sometimes masquerade as good ones. I want him to learn the difference." Sarah stepped aside, gesturing for Crawford to enter the house. "I'm saying that a man who would ride through a storm to save strangers, who would risk his life to help deliver a baby, might be worth saving himself." Crawford remained frozen in the doorway, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. "You're offering me forgiveness." "I'm offering you a chance to earn it," Sarah corrected. "The barn needs rebuilding, the ranch needs work, and I need help. Thomas left me with debts and creditors who won't wait much longer. If you're serious about making amends, there's plenty of work to be done here." As if sensing the importance of the moment, the baby stirred in Sarah's arms, opening his eyes to look directly at Crawford. The sheriff felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the tight bands of guilt that had constricted his breathing for months. "What will you name him?" Crawford asked, extending a finger that the baby immediately grasped with surprising strength. "Thomas James McKinnon," Sarah said, watching Crawford's face carefully. "Thomas for his father, and James for the man who brought him safely into this world." Crawford felt tears sting his eyes, a luxury he hadn't allowed himself in years. "Ma'am, I don't deserve that honor." "Maybe not," Sarah said with the faintest smile. "But my son will. And maybe by the time he's old enough to understand his name, you'll have grown into it." As the morning sun climbed higher over the Texas plains, Sarah McKinnon and James Crawford stood together in the doorway of a small ranch house, a newborn baby between them representing all the hope and possibility that tomorrow could bring. The storm had passed, leaving destruction in its wake, but also clearing the air for new growth. Sometimes redemption comes not in grand gestures, but in the quiet choice to build something better from the ruins of what came before. In the unforgiving territory of the American frontier, where second chances were rarer than water in the desert, two broken souls had found a way to heal each other. Stories like Sarah and Crawford's remind us that even in our darkest moments, when everything seems lost, hope can arrive as unexpectedly as a sheriff's horse stopping at our gate. If this tale of redemption and new beginnings touched your heart, subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell to never miss these powerful stories of human resilience. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that it's never too late for a fresh start, and tell us in the comments about a time when someone gave you a second chance when you needed it most. Your story matters, and together we can keep spreading hope across the frontier of human experience.